Hello, Garland Nixon here, and it's we're getting started an early morning here in Maryland, but not so early in London. But we have the brilliant Joti Brar, and we've got a lot of things to talk about. We've got a world that's coming apart, and Joti is going to glue it back together some kind of way. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Joti Brar, and I better try to get things. Joti's kind of tall, and I just want to make sure that we don't look that I don't look like she's towering over me. But at any rate, so let's go. Something's interesting that something I wanted to ask Joti about and get her opinion on, and that is South Korea. I did a video yesterday where I talked to KJ No, a brilliant guy who's really does a lot of good work out in San Francisco, working on issues of peace. And we talked about South Korea. So this is a country that basically has a history of the U.S. empire installing, brutal dictators, and they had what one may call the appearance of democracy for some period of time. So recently, the U.S. has tried to drag them into a full spectrum war with China. And one of the things that they've done is they've brought them into this chip war against China. Well, they've got Samsung, they've got big chip companies, they've got big tech companies, and the people are hurting. And they've been pushing back, and the president of China, of South Korea, whatever you want to call him, I don't know what he is, a prime minister, a president, whatever, decided to declare martial law to surround the parliament with police and military. And the parliament broke through and voted down the martial law. Bottom line, we're seeing the various colonies of the U.S. empire, that's what I'm calling them, in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, really pushing back. And I think a big part of it is the deterioration of the economic, the deterioration of the material means of the working class, and people are getting angry. But what's interesting is that iron fist of, well, doggone it, we're going to declare martial law. It's like, we're going to stop pretending that this thing is some kind of democracy. And we're seeing more and more of that anyway. Joti, you're in Europe. You're seeing what's happening in the UK. You're seeing what's happening in Germany, South Korea. To me, that's the same thing, just a little different variety, because they have a history of a military dictatorship. They figured, what the heck, let's take the mask off and go back where we need to do to get things done. Your thoughts on all of this, Joti?
Thanks, Garland. There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? You're right in a sense that it's what we're seeing as the same thing everywhere, which is we're seeing the symptoms and the response to the global overproduction crisis. The symptoms are everywhere: unemployment, impoverishment of the masses, and therefore deep discontent and anger and difficulty, whether in the imperialist heartlands or in the oppressed countries and even the fully colonized countries, of stability of rule is being upset very much. Something we have to recognize is different about South Korea compared to, say, Britain or America, is South Korea is a colony. South Korea is a direct colony. It has an occupying force of some, 37,000 US troops, huge numbers of US weapons. Those forces essentially are in charge of South Korea. The US military is in charge of the South Korean military. The US security services are in charge of the Korean security services. So South Korea, in its history of existence, which was always a history of subverting the will of the Korean people, let's not forget, if I can just go back a tiny bit to World War II, that period when the united Korean people fought under the leadership of Kim Il-sung to get rid of Japanese colonialism, occupation from Korea. The whole of Korea had been occupied by Japan since, I think, 1910. It was a very brutal colonization. There is still a huge anti-Japanese hatred amongst Korean people because of the way that Korea suffered during those years of Japanese occupation. So the Koreans liberated themselves during World War II. They were on the anti-fascist side in the war, and they won. And they had help from the Soviet Union. The Red Army came and helped them with the last stages. Before that, they'd had help from the Chinese, and they had help after liberation from the Chinese. Equally, Koreans helped in the Chinese Liberation War. So the Chinese Revolution and liberation struggle, and the Japanese and the Korean liberation struggle and revolution were very intimately connected. Many of the leaders and fighters and guerrillas went backwards and forwards across the mountains and helped one another at different stages of the war against Japan and the war for freedom and then the war for socialism. So that was the beginning of Korea's independence and freedom in the 20th century. And then what happened was the USA came and occupied the South as a counterbalance to the fact that the Red Army was in the North. And it was supposed to be that after a couple of years of making sure that the Japanese were definitely disarmed and gone, the Americans and the Soviets would all leave and let the Korean people decide their future. Well, the Soviets did indeed leave the North, and the people of the North chose socialism under Kim Il-sung. The people of the South never got the chance to choose their fate. The occupation remained, it became permanent. And in fact, the USA armed and incentivized and mobilized all of the collaborationist forces in South Korea, which had collaborated with the fascist occupiers. They armed them and turned them into the new privileged caste, the new security state, and turned them against the communists of the South. Communist and national liberation forces were brutally massacred and put down in the South. That was the basis of the South Korean state. That is what it is. It was founded to stop communism taking the whole of the Korean peninsula, which it would have done. It was to stop Korea becoming free, sovereign, and independent, and to give the USA a base in this vital area. And as you've said, Korea borders Russia, which used to be the Soviet Union, and China, right? And it's very close to Japan. So it's in a really pivotal, as you know, the way that the imperialists see the world. They see the map like it's a series of points that are useful for accessing other points, and you've got to control that bit so you can control that bit. So, and the world's their chessboard, as they like to tell us. So they see, Korea that way. Number one, it has its own resources and ability to have quite a power in the world. A united Korea could be quite a power in the world. Has a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of abilities. But it's also geostrategically, its alignment with the Soviet Union and People's China was seriously problematic for the USA when it was trying to contain the spread of socialism across Asia. And it sees, it constantly imagines a kind of domino effect, or if we let South Korea go, then, chip round what's going to happen in the rest of the Pacific. Of course, they're right to be worried about that because good examples do indeed spread, but that's the way that they see Korea. They have been occupying South Korea as a colony, and we can never, it's the same that we see when we look at Ukraine or when we look at Israel. You can't look at their politics as if there's something isolated from the USA, because they're not. These are all governments that are really there by the permission of the occupying force. They're there to give a garnish to the occupation, a frill on the front of it, so you can tell the world that it's this great, successful democracy. But the reality is that it is a colony. And actually, if you look at the history of South Korea, you see over the years they have they have swung backwards and forwards between open dictatorship type of governments and supposedly reformist democratic governments. But just this year, you know, the reality is those are two faces of the same coin. It's like Labour, Tory, you know, in the end, it's the USA that's in charge. In the end, it's still a colony, no matter which face they put on it, how they dress it up for public consumption. And, you know, the North Koreans themselves, just in the last year, haven't they, just before New Year, and then at New Year, they kind of reasserted it, have said, we are done with negotiating with South Korean governments. They're not in a position to negotiate anything. And even when they talk words of peace, they don't mean it. They're only front people for the US occupying force. And actually, you know, what stands behind them is a permanently hostile order that has no plan and no desire to make peace with us. So we give up on the idea that there's a road to peaceful reunification of our peninsula. You know, for a long time, the DPRK, North Korea, followed a policy of trying to pursue peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula because the Korean people are one nation who have been forcibly divided and do not want to be divided. And they said, look, we can have one country, two systems. We can have a federal country where you keep your capitalists out, you know, and let the people decide, and we keep our socialism in the north. But we are free and independent as a whole country, reunited and not under anybody's occupation or control. And they tried to pursue that through all kinds of peaceful avenues. And every time they went a little bit down that road, they just found they came up against this hard barrier. And that any pledges that were made by any government, you couldn't rely on them actually being fulfilled, right? So they've given up, they tore this all up. And they've now identified that their principal enemy, in fact, the principal block to peace, is the regime in South Korea, which is a front for US imperialism. And they've said this regime has to be forcibly removed and defeated. There's no point negotiating with it. And they've said very clearly, we see you pushing towards war. We see that the ROK regime, they call it ROK, Republic of Korea, and they always put it in quotes, like, because it's not a republic, right? But this South Korean regime is being used by the USA to ratchet up war tensions incessantly. And again, the government of the North has been very clear. We will not provoke this war, but we are ready for it. We understand that you are pushing for it. And there's going to come a point where we won't have any choice because it will be forced on us. But we know it's coming and we're prepared for it and we have a plan and we will be decapitating the leadership of this fascist and what's the word I'm looking for? Not legitimate, illegitimate, thank you, illegitimate regime, right? So that's the direction that the USA is pushing things. And we have to recognize when we see these leaders and all the drama and the ins and outs of kind of domestic politics in Israel, in Ukraine, in South Korea, you have to understand always behind it stands the USA, US imperialism, and their motivations, what they want to see happen. Now, of course, their proxies also have motivations, and it's interesting how similar their motivations are. Because just as we see in Ukraine, just as we see in Israel, we're seeing in South Korea that the leading figures, President Yoon and his wife in particular, but a lot of people around them, are mired. They're incredibly unpopular, and they're mired in corruption scandals. And if they don't do something, they're going to end up in court, being impeached and being imprisoned. And many other South Korean leaders have in the past been imprisoned on corruption charges during or after they left office, right? Because let's face it, if you're fronting up as a fake politician for an imperialist regime that just wants to make it look as if there's a democracy underneath its occupation, then the main thing that you're doing is feathering your nest. You're not there to serve the people. You're there to serve the imperialists. And the way you do it is through a whole load of backhanders. I mean, we all, we make jokes about how corrupt Zelensky and his regime are. It's not really that funny, but, it's because that's what they're grifters. That's what they're there for. It was the same with the Afghan regime. You know, it's not a coincidence that everywhere the Americans have an occupation, suddenly that country becomes known as the most corrupt country in the world. And nobody seems to put the pieces together. It's like it's America that's corrupt, right? They are paying their servants for being front people for their occupation. And so they can go around and talk about freedom and democracy, you know, this weird dissonance, and we're not supposed to notice, you know. So the media constantly pumps at us, you know, like they used to talk to us about Afghan democracy, you know, how it was freeing the women, you know, and then they talked about President Zelensky's amazing democracy, you know, against the evil dictatorial Russians. They talk to us about Israeli democracy as opposed to the terrible dictatorial Iranians. And they talk to us about South Korean democracy as opposed to the terrible dictatorial North Koreans, right? It's all theater. It's all total lies. More and more people are waking up to the fact that these are lies. But so this motivation internally for the politicians to declare martial law, it comes from two directions. There is definitely an expediency, like ramping up the war distracts people from the corruption cases and the scandals in which the government is constantly mired. But fundamentally, I think we have to see it as part of the US's desire to keep ratcheting up the war, the war globally, that it is losing. So they're really staring defeat in the face in Russia. But they can't just let it go, because the whole of their system's survival is pinned on this strategy of destroying Russia and destroying China and getting a big bonanza and not having competitors and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way they're going to reboot their dying economy in their mind, okay? So the plan to destabilize Russia, if we go back to, now I forget, was it the Rand Institute?
The Rand report of 2019, yes.
That said overextending Russia, right? Or extending.
And unbalancing, yes.
Right. So that's been their strategy all along. So Ukraine is a part of extending Russia. Georgia, the color revolution attempts are still ongoing in Georgia, is a part of that. Try to extend Russia. The attempts to create problems in Armenia and Azerbaijan, well, they haven't attempted, they have been creating problems there. You know, all along Russia's borders, if you look, there's constant ongoing provocations. Syria, you know, on the one hand, you can see how the attack on Syria is part of, you know, trying to keep Israel's dominance intact in the Middle East and trying to save the war against the Axis. That's the one, the axis of resistance in the Middle East. But it's also directly impinging on Russia. Syria is a major ally of Russia. Russia, of course, helped Syria to repel the jihadi invasion backed by the USA and Israel and Turkey from 2011 onwards. The Russians intervened, I think, 2015, and decisively. So moving the main front of the war to Syria is an attempt to try to give another lease of life to the Israeli war effort, while also pushing on Russia, trying to get Russia to send, you know, what they really want to do is try to find a way that Russia just becomes, as that report said, overextended, not able to keep the flames doused in all these different areas, forces spread too thin, social unrest, revolution from within, Vladimir Putin's government falls and Ronald McDonald comes marching in, right? That is essentially their plan for rebooting their system. And of course, in that geostrategic way that they like to think, it's also, they see it as a stepping stone to China, which they're desperate to bring down and defeat. They know they can't take it head on, but again, they're lighting fires all around China's borders. And Korea is one of them. So Korea is a fire that goes in two directions. You know, the desire to make war with and destroy the socialist government in North Korea and the socialist state of North Korea has three purposes. One is for its own sake. They have always wanted to destroy North Korean socialism and have the whole of Korea as their base and colony. They hate the example it gives to the world. They hate the way that the North Koreans have been able to first defeat them in the Korean War in 1953. And they were the first people to defeat US imperialism, were the Koreans. I mean, it was an armistice that was signed, but essentially it was because the USA was beaten. And that was the first time that had happened. And they didn't fight by themselves. They were 14 countries joined that under the United Nations flag. 14 countries invaded, a country that was very poor and war-torn, and they were beaten. So that was a kind of historic achievement. And North Korea has been absolutely doggedly socialist since then, despite all the difficulties of the Soviet Union's collapse, which was one of its major trading partners, China becoming much kind of softer in its approach to the rest of the world, going through its reform and opening up process, during which period, although it never completely abandoned, trading with and giving some support to North Korea, it very often was hanging it out to dry diplomatically, allowing sanctions and economically allowing the USA and the Security Council to pass sanctions orders and all the rest of it through the Security Council, and agreeing with the imperialists that something needed to be done about North Korea's nuclear program, a nuclear program that it specifically developed so that it could defend itself against nuclear blackmail. And it's been successful in that. It's been hugely successful. And everybody now knows that the reason North Korea hasn't been made war on is because it has nuclear weapons and it has a strong army and the ability to defend itself. And we only have to look at Libya and Iraq to see what happens when you disarm and believe what the imperialists tell you about, if you disarm, we'll leave you alone. Disarmament was always the prelude to a full-scale invasion, because now you can't hit us back and we have total dominance. Well, North Korea has done the opposite. They've said, we will catch up with you technologically. They have hypersonic missiles that the USA doesn't have. They have all kinds of ballistic missiles that can, and they've shown they've got missiles that can reach the shores of the United States of America. And they have all, big and small types of nuclear weapons. So, they've made a point of catching up and being able to have parity and even in some cases surpass the type of weaponry that the USA has. So the USA wants to destroy North Korea if it possibly can. Right now, it feels that this is the moment because it's desperately trying to keep the war going against Russia. It's desperate to bring Russia down as a prelude to bringing China down. And it's been watching with much fear and incredulity the collapse of all of its brilliant scheming to keep these countries apart. They're all closer than they've ever been since the death of Stalin and Mao, right? In the time of Stalin, there was an unbreakable bloc across that part of the world. And it was absolutely, totally in lockstep. And we haven't seen that in the period since. And the USA was very good at getting in there and into every division and making it wider, to the point where, China considered the USSR to be more of an enemy than the USA, which is a terrible mistake, right? Really a big mistake. But everybody's been learning lessons, through this period, thank goodness. And now we see Russia and China's alliance growing very firmly, Russia and DPRK's alliance growing very firmly. And that's really upset the West, because it basically means the sanctions regime against North Korea is dead. And everything they tried to do to bring North Korea down has not been done. So just quickly coming back to that, why are they pushing this war? I think, it's for all of those reasons. They want to bring back down North Korea. They think now is the moment because they don't want to let Russia have any breathing space. They want Russia's war to keep going on as many fronts as possible. They want to make sure that North Korea is not able to give any help to Russia in its war. And equally, Russia's not able to give any help to the DPRK. And they see all of this as a prelude to attacking China.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this. With South Korea and the Philippines, places like that, it's like blatantly obvious that they're colonies. You know, it's kind of, they're unapologetic about the way they dominate these countries. Europe, there's a much greater pretense of independence and sovereignty, right? Germany, everything that you said about South Korea when you were talking about how they were occupied, and basically, you know, we were discussing how the the US's machinations to take out China is obliterating South Korea's tech industry and chip industry and things of that nature. And the South Koreans are really pushing back. You know, they haven't really covered the organized labor's revolt over the last several years. That, you know, that isn't covered in Western media. Germany, to me, I see a strong parallel between the two. The difference is Olaf Scholz hasn't, you know, declared himself a dictator yet. He's got Annalena Baerbock for that, I guess. But your thoughts on Germany and the I guess inevitable pushback that's coming or starting from the working class because of the obvious, and I mean just precipitous economic and industrial collapse, because they're simply being used as a political and military tool against Russia. Your thoughts on this whole dynamic in Germany? That operation, that imperial operation, seems to be coming apart also.
You know, it's really interesting, and we've been learning a lot, I think, during the course of Russia's SMO in Ukraine about the relationship between the European imperialist powers and US imperialism. And it can be quite confusing, I think, for people when they to look at it and make sense of it, because it's tempting to say, well, we're all just colonies, right? Everybody's just subservient to the USA. Doesn't that make us colonies? Well, it doesn't quite. What we've seen is, you know, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy to some extent, these countries are all still, and Spain, still home to vast stores of finance capital. You can see that by the way that our people, even our poor workers, are living better than people, you know, in middle class jobs in poor countries, even though they are employed in jobs which are entirely unproductive. Very few workers in the imperialist countries now produce any new wealth for society, and yet they are living a nice, and even though it's declining, it's what a lot of people in the rest of the world would still consider to be a nice standard of living, right? And the reason is because we are parasites. Our economies are parasites, and they turn us as individuals into parasites. We don't create the wealth that we are living off of. It all comes in through the square mile, through the City of London, through the Bourse in whatever the Paris one is called, and through the stock exchange in Berlin. You know, it comes in, it's looted from the rest of the world via all these colonial mechanisms, some of which we've been looking at in recent times. Like, for example, we saw the example of uranium that's looted out of Niger, and how 99.5% of that wealth goes straight to France, and 0.5% of it is left behind for, you know, a few Nigerians to try to dish out amongst themselves. So these mechanisms of loot, you know, so look in the Middle East and see how Syrian oil, you know, the richest part of Syria has been under occupation for like a decade, and that oil is going straight out to where the USA wants to put it, with the Syrian people paid nothing at all. 100% of that wealth is going elsewhere, although it's the Syrian people's wealth, right? So we see these colonial structures in place, and this is the basis for the living standards of even the poorest worker in the West. It's not always clear to people, because they see their living standard declining and they're angry about it, and they see the subservience of their politicians to the US system. They feel like, oh, we've turned into a colony, but it's not really the truth of the matter, economically speaking. But what we have seen, and what's become clearer and clearer and clearer over the last, you know, 5 years in particular has been that our politicians, our ruling classes are directing our politicians in such a way that they are totally subservient to US interests. And it's not because they're mindless and thoughtless. It's because basically after World War II, a deal was done. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that this deal basically was that the European imperialists would be allowed to continue as imperialists. They'd be allowed to continue their looting, plundering activities, financially in the rest of the world, but they wouldn't be suffered to regrow independent military machines. We militarily have become adjuncts to the US military machine. And what that basically means is, while we can, we see that Britain loves to go up and do its special ops and little provocations around the place and all the dirty tasks. And it's very handy for the USA to hand over some of these dirty tasks to Britain and say, oh, it wasn't us. And a big part of what's in it for the US, and we must never forget this when Trump's all this, oh, there's nothing in it for us, all this wars and everything, it's because he doesn't understand where the big money's really made in America, right? That America's wealth and the great, again, that he wants to bring back is American being the biggest imperialist power on the planet. But to be the only imperialist power would be somewhat problematic. And especially when we live in an era of national liberation and you have to pretend you're not an imperialist while being an imperialist. So having a world system and a family of nations and having smaller imperialist powers that you can stand next to and say, no, we're the world community and we're just a family of nations who all agree about freedom and democracy. And it's not us telling everybody what to do. It's us helping everybody get freedom. And, they dressed up their imperialism in such a way that they made it look as if there was a whole load of nations who all agree with each other and they're the civilized ones. It's the civilized world bringing civilization to everybody else. So it's useful for the USA for there to be a bunch of smaller imperialist powers. It's useful for the ruling classes in France, Germany, Britain to tag themselves onto the USA, US military and the US hedge funds, because they've all become very interlinked economically. But it's useful for them, because they get to keep looting the world. But they don't have the ability to back up their economic might with independent military might. That's why they basically have to do it all together now. And it's actually a part of the decline of the imperialist system as a whole, that there is really only one imperialist pole now. There's not really, although there's a lot of contradictions inside there. And you see the anger and the frustration of the smaller capitalists to the big ones and the smaller countries to the bigger ones, and countries that thought of themselves as real big world powers feeling like they have to take a hit for America in order to keep on the game, and that they don't like that, right? And you see the British desperately trying to cope, tell themselves how they're still the power behind the throne, tell themselves they're the Greeks to the Romans, we're the civilized ones, we're the ones who really know how to do this properly, we're the ones with culture, we're the ones with history, you guys are just the brainless muscle, and yet they are not in a position to do anything unless the USA tells them they can. And one of it's not really about Germany, sorry, but it's on this topic of the kind of integrated military situation and the fact that we have allowed ourselves to become very much under the control of the USA is in the way our militaries work. So you said in Germany, and you're absolutely right, their secret services and their military are directly under NATO command and CIA command, and have been since the foundation of West Germany. And that hasn't really changed at any point. Britain, we see something similar. In recent years, we keep finding things out that we're not supposed to know, I think. One was about Trident. We spend this huge amount of money on this nuclear submarine program that's supposed to make us a superpower in the world, make us relevant and important and powerful. It turns out that the software in the Trident submarines is basically under the control of the USA. We can't fire a nuclear weapon unless the USA says yes and, updates the software and gives the code and turns the key and whatever, right? It's under US control fundamentally, although officially it's British security that it's protecting. you know, of course, as in Germany, so in Britain, there's a whole load of American bases on our soil, which we have no jurisdiction over, no sovereignty over, no ability even to hold to account, you know, the behavior of people on those bases. As we saw a couple of years ago when a woman who lived on one of the bases and turned out to be a kind of American deep state operative, killed a guy in a road crash and just hightailed it out of the country, and there was no ability to call her back or find out what happened or even know what she was doing here, because the story they gave was she was the wife of a diplomat, and then it turned out she was a high-ranking spook. It's like, who is this woman? What was she doing here? What was she up to? And how come she's allowed to kill some young guy on the roads and just leave? Right. So that was a kind of scandal that lasted for a little while, and then everyone forgot about it. But more recently, it's been turned out, we've seen in Ukraine that we officially, British imperialism, has some weapons. They call them long range. They're not long range, are they? They're intermediate range ballistic missiles, these Storm Shadows, right? That's the British high-end missile that everybody wants. Oh, well, it turns out you can't fire those without American permission either, right? Because they're all reliant on technology that the British don't have independently. It's the Americans have it. The Americans control it. Therefore, if you want to fire a Storm Shadow missile, some American has got to sort something out for you and give you permission. Right? So our vaunted, independent military capabilities are not independent at all. And what we find we're kind of reduced to as a nation is whispering in America's ear and trying to persuade them to be more bloodthirsty than they are already, and more war hungry and more, because ultimately the British ruling class's only ability to stay where it is through total victory of the USA militarily. And, without that, they are collapsing. And so they're really rabid. And you see that the Labour Party is more rabid than the Tories, and Britain's more rabid than the Americans. And you see that how that relationship kind of goes, really.
What's interesting, something that I wrote a note on, and that is the productive worker. You talked about unproductive workers in the empire. And I thought, we have now a system where a lot of young people, they're like, I won't take a job unless I can work from home. After COVID, everyone wants to work from home. And I thought about it. I thought, I have friends who are, making great money, and they sit home, and in the morning they turn on their computers and they quote work on their computers, and they're in their pajamas all day. And then at some point they're no longer at work. And I thought, okay, you're working from home and you're doing whatever it is you're doing. For some company that doesn't even have a headquarters, oftentimes it's all online, and you're selling services or whatever to someone who's buying them online. That the person who's supposedly working at the company is online, the company's online, and the ultimate person who purchases your service or whatever it is online. And if you're selling something, it's made in China, where productive work is done. So now I'm online. I'm working, marketing, and selling a product that's made in China to some person in Pittsburgh who buys this product online, doesn't get in the car, doesn't drive, doesn't go over to the store where somebody's working. Used to be, if I bought the product, someone had to go into the back room and in the warehouse. And I can remember going to, when I was a kid or something, and your parents buy a new refrigerator and you go to the store or whatever, you pick out some salesperson points it out. Oh, that's the refrigerator that you want. Someone goes into the back and they put it on something with wheels and roll it out, and maybe they deliver it, or your family has a truck or something, they throw it in there, it gets home. And people were doing things with their hands, and every one of those people get paid. The person who sold it in the store is gone. The person who got it out of the back warehouse is gone. The person who delivered, all these people are gone. You just have some person who's marketing this refrigerator to you online that's made in China. And then ultimately, it gets to your home, but it's shipped from China and it's shipped to your home and there's no productive worker really much in between. So the idea that we've got millions of people who wake up every morning and they're in their pajamas staring at a screen, and that's productive work, is preposterous. And that's kind of what our society's been reduced to. And I look at that and I'm like, well, that can't continue. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
It's really fragile, isn't it, Garland? You know, what you're describing there is the very advanced stage of the global division of labor that we've seen, because it turns out if you do your productive laboring in poorer countries where the labor is cheaper, the land is cheaper, there's fewer regulations and weaker unions, you'll make much bigger profits from that production than you do at home. So over this actually it's been like a century and a half, this process has been ongoing. You know, 150 years ago, Britain was known as the workshop of the world. Well, Britain doesn't make anything anymore. It's all made in, as you said, mainly China, but not only, you know, but it's made in countries where the workforce is cheap and the land is cheap and all the rest of it. So we've had this kind of global division of labor take place. Now, the jobs that people are doing in Britain, you know, I mean, definitely a whole load of them you could think we could do without. Who needs marketing anyway? But in a capitalist system, marketing is the job that needs doing, and so is transporting goods from, you know, where they're produced to where they're going to end up. So those jobs always happened. And there always was that division of labor in capitalist society between the people who are making them and the people who are marketing them and the people who sell them to the public, or, you know, people who deliver them, logistics and all of that. And those jobs aren't productive jobs. They never were productive jobs. They're the money to pay for those jobs, you know, the owners of companies that do logistics, the owners of companies that do marketing make a profit. But they're getting a cut from the wealth that's produced by the original productive worker who made the product. And that gets spread out between different capitalists for their different roles in getting this good to market, as it were, or to the consumer. What is very lopsided is to be in a situation where when it comes to, you know, all of the higher paid jobs are tending to happen in the West. Not all of them. If they can find ways to outsource those, then they also do, right? But more and more, the kind of jobs that people are doing here are the higher end, you know, the ones you can do without producing new wealth, but need to be done as far as capitalism is concerned. They're happening here, and the production is happening somewhere else. And what we're seeing is increasing, like you said, because of the onlineification of so many things, the industry that's really booming in this country, which again, it's not productive, but it's an essential part of distribution, is logistics. So we've had the privatization of the postal service. So you have this huge kind of cowboy land of, you know, a plethora of distribution firms, logistics companies, who really push down on the pay, wages, conditions of their workers in order to really rinse them for profit. But it's not productive work. These people aren't producing new wealth. They might be making a lot of money for their boss, but fundamentally, it's not where wealth is being produced. And that's the thing that's hard to sometimes get your head around. You know, where do people in Britain today, I look around, people working in logistics, people are working in care, or in the health service. People are working, some of them in call centers and in hospitality, whether that's cafes, restaurants, you know, pubs, hotels, you know, tourism of some kind. Huge amount of seasonal and tourist focused work and hospitality work. And increasingly, you know, that's what our kids are being trained for out of school. You know, they're not being trained to be engineers or to go into a factory. They're being trained to go and work in a pub kitchen or a hotel, or be a barista, you know, so just servicing one another, you know, but none of this is making new meaningful wealth for society, right? All of that is being done through this global division of labor. And that's how you know you're an imperialist country, because we're not producing new wealth, and yet we live as if we are, right? Britain is a tiny country with a small population and minimal resources compared to most places in the world, and yet it's in the top 6 or 7 economies. Why? Only because we're living as parasites on other parts of the world. And Germany has been an interesting case precisely because West Germany had to compete with East Germany, just the same as they did with South Korea. South Korea had to compete with North Korea. North Korea was way ahead of South Korea for a long time after liberation, in its development, its technological development, and its ability to deliver a good life to its people. So for PR purposes, for kind of anti-communist propaganda purposes, West Germany and South Korea and Japan were massively invested in to rebuild their industries and try to make a show of them being able to match up to the socialist economies next door. GDR had a really thriving, self-reliant, strong technical foundation, very productive socialist economy. So West Germany's industry was rebuilt, even as France and Britain were continuing this process of exporting all of their industrial jobs because it's more profitable. These were kind of special cases, and the USA bankrolled a lot of that, right? Precisely because it was part of the contain and try to prove you're outperforming socialism. It was a very important part of the Cold War. It's a propaganda effort, basically. So it was a kind of unnatural reversal of what naturally would have happened, that the West German economy got built up as an industrial economy. And it was for purely propaganda purposes. But the deindustrialization we're seeing now, it didn't begin in 2022. It's been ongoing for some time. Everybody in Germany knows there's been a lot of that offshoring of industrial jobs to China already and to other places like that. What happened was this process has been massively accelerated because of the sudden cutting of the energy that it was relying on. And it's become very evident to people, and because it's accelerated the process, then of course that creates social unrest. Whenever you do something quickly and people really notice it, and you don't drop them into it slowly bit by bit, it's the boil the frog thing, isn't it?
Right.
If you dropped a frog into boiling water, it would hop right out again. But if you put it in cold water and heat it up slowly, you can actually get away with cooking it, because it just happens bit by bit, and it doesn't have the ability to jump out, at the crucial moment. Well, the ruling class kind of knows that when it comes to, lowering the standard of living of its people. In general, it tries to do it step by step, in intervals that are manageable. The difficulty is it's not always able to be in charge of that, because as much as people like to imagine that the ruling class, everything that happens is according to the plan of the ruling class, it very often isn't. And they're not quite in control, and they're trying to manage after the fact, that chaotic things are happening, and how do we kind of try to regain some semblance of order and control.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this too, since we've been talking a while, we got a few more minutes left. This whole concept of liberalism, as it were, right, seems to also be in collapse, right? So for all of this time, what we were told was the quote liberals, the Hollywood types, the whatever, the New York liberals, right? These were the good guys. Oh, they're for standing up for minorities and the rights of everyone, whatever group, they are naming various groups, even coming up with new names for old groups, right? BIPOC, Black or Indigenous people of color, acronyms, you name it, right? To demonstrate how really good they were and how they were standing up for the rights of everyone, right? And it seems to have collapsed into this like overtly fascist cult, where now the liberalism is kind of defined by its enemies, who it hates. It's kind of defined by an attempt at total domination. It's kind of aligned with this whole, there is no alternative neoliberalism. And so the veneer of we're the good guys and we're the tolerant. I hate that word, tolerant good guys. You know, tolerant. We tolerate our lessers. You know, so the mask is off on liberalism. It's being really rejected now. Don't get me wrong. One of the things I see is people are like, liberalism is terrible, so we'll go for conservatism. Well, I think this is a natural, I think, direction that people are going to reach over here for something and say this may be better, and then they'll find out that they just got something repackaged but similar, and then you start, in my opinion, you start getting into revolutionary dynamics. But my point being, liberalism, you know, we're the good guys to now there's this, we have dogma, you know, really dogmatic positions. And if someone says, well, you know, I have some questions about that, you lowlife, you must be punished, you must be thrown off of all platforms. You know, it's dogmatic, it's angry, it's constantly offended, and it's always trying to punish its enemies, and its enemies are anyone who disagrees with anything they say. It's amazing what's happened with this whole liberalism thingy and what it's turned into. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I hope you don't mind me giving a little plug for my very small book. It's called Identity Politics or Class Politics. And the very first sentence, hang on. I don't know if you can see that. There's liberalism or socialism. And it talks about what is liberalism as a first thing. And it does talk later on about this whole cancel culture and all the rest of it. So it's relevant. That's why I'm giving it a little plug. And I'll put a post to it on my Telegram channel after this. But, you know, liberalism is the ideology of the bourgeoisie. It's the capitalist class's ideology. It was their revolutionary ideology against feudalism, because it said all power to the individual, and you know, the free movement for individuals, essentially free thought and free movement for individuals against the stifling feudal order. That was its revolutionary content, but it's become purely hypocritical, you know, philosophy today. In the declining capitalist class calls liberalism it's free market fundamentalism, basically. But what we tend to think of as liberals, we're thinking of left liberals, right? The ones who have a social conscience, but they live inside an imperialist country. And essentially, when they talk about wanting equal rights, they're talking about wanting capitalism to be fair. And there's certain times where they can go around and, you know, be quite convincing when everything is good in life, when everything is stable and the economy is booming and life for the mass of the people is basically okay. The left liberal seems like a very nice kind of a person. They just want everybody to be nice to one another. They want capitalism with kinder characteristics. They want people to be nice to each other. They don't want racism. Well, they want capitalism to have a civilized veneer and not to create too much inequality and not to create too much racism. But even in the good times, that's basically an impossible ask. But because they don't understand the roots of inequality and they don't understand the roots of racism, they imagine that the way to solve these things is to lecture people and re-educate people. Oh, the inequality sometimes is something to do with prejudice, that racism is something to do with people not being educated in how to be nice to one another. And if I could just explain to them, if I could explain to the ruling class how to be nice and not be so greedy, we'd have less inequality. If I could explain to the white people how to be nice, we wouldn't have racism. You know, so it's already wrong and confused in the good times. But fundamentally, it's about conscience salving measures within the confines of the capitalist system. It doesn't want to threaten the capitalist economic order because it's the point of view of people who have privileges within this system, and they don't really want to lose them. They just feel a bit guilty about them. So they want to feel better about their position in society. They want to feel like they deserve their position. They don't want to lose their position, and they definitely don't want to bring down the whole world order. They just don't like the fact that a bit of them feels bad, So there's the kind of motivation it's warped, it's confused from the beginning. And basically the left liberals are the left social democrats. They are the kind of left Labour type of people. And that path from being a nice liberal to being a really intemperate authoritarian is a well-worn one. Many of your viewers, probably are shocked when I bring up the name of Joseph Stalin, but I really recommend people to read Joseph Stalin and find out for themselves how much you have been lied to about what he was, who he was, and what his politics represented. He was an absolutely brilliant guy, and he described social democracy, which is the ideology of the Labour aristocracy in the imperialist countries. It's the ideology of the privileged section of the working class and petit bourgeois who want to keep the system going because that's how their privileges, are maintained. And they tend to be the people who run the working class movement in the West. They tend to be the people they've been bribed and bought off through the profits of the system. And they keep control over the angry masses. That's basically their role. But Joseph Stalin said in the 1930s that social democracy is the moderate wing of fascism. And we saw in Germany how it was the social democrats after 1919 who were in charge of the regime which massacred the communists who had been heading up the revolution. There was a socialist revolutionary movement that was, didn't manage to be successful after World War I in Germany, that was led by communists. The communists were massacred by a regime that the social democrats were in charge of. They were the ones who sent squads onto the street to kill communists and persecute them and lock them up. They were the ones who laid all the foundations and essentially handed over at a certain point the keys to Hitler and the Nazis. So they facilitated the restoration of capitalist and imperialist stability in Germany. And when the moment was right and the revolution had been suppressed enough, they handed over to the fascists to the next stage of capitalist stabilization. So they act together. Social democracy and fascism are two wings, two sides of the same coin of how the bourgeoisie likes to present itself at different times in different situations. A bit like what we were talking about earlier when it comes to, say, the two faces of government you get in South Korea. One day they're moderate reformers who like democracy, the next day that they're authoritarian fascists, but they're both fronts for US imperialism, and it's the same. Social democracy and fascism are just different tactics of the imperialist ruling class at home in how it deals with its own people. So it's not shocking that one can turn into the other. What we have to be really careful of is the culture war's knee-jerk response to that. Because learning that the liberals have betrayed you and they're not what they pretended to be and they're not offering us any kind of salvation, that's a good lesson to learn. Yes, we need to understand the liberals and the social democrats will never be our friends. And particularly the leadership and the organizations, they are the enemies of the working class. But a lot of the people they've suckered into following them are good people who we need to talk to and explain to them how they're being misled and that following these leaders is taking them away from their own interests. Just the same we need to say to the people who've been suckered by the extreme right. The leadership, the demagogues who manipulate the people with racist rhetoric and, this type of right-wing extremism. They're doing it in the interests of finance capital and against the interests of the people who follow them. So while we hate the leadership and have to point out how they're betraying the interests of working people and acting, to keep us divided, we need to be able to talk to the people who follow them. What we can't allow ourselves to do, because all of those people are being misled against their own interests, just in different directions. What we can't allow ourselves to do is play into this idea of political life as a football team kind of sport, team sport, where you identify with one team and you identify with the leaders of the team who are your class enemies, and you unify with them against the other team, against the workers in the other team who you've identified as your absolute enemy. And very often in this culture wars approach, you'll find on both sides poor working class people not only identifying with members of the ruling class instead of with each other, but actually calling on the state of their enemy class, to help them repress the other side. And if the state's repressing the other side, it's doing a good thing. And if the state's repressing their side, it's doing a terrible thing. But it fosters illusions in the state and the state's role and what the state is actually for. The point is, when we live in an imperialist country, the state is the state of the finance capitalists. It's not there to serve the working people, and you can't make it serve the working people. And we have to learn these lessons and learn how to overcome these culture wars kind of mindset, which is very actively pushed on us, precisely in order to keep us weak, divided, stupid, looking the wrong way, identifying with the wrong people, and failing to fight for our own class interests.
Last thing, and that is something that's I'd like you to comment on. And I, like, a lot of times I look at the chat and see things, and it inspires me. Something that's going on, particularly in the U.S. now, in the U.S. empire, and that is as this liberal thing becomes less and less popular, becomes despised, basically, absolutely despised in the United States, more and more and more. What the ruling elite are doing is they are redefining, so that a Joe Biden, a guy who's surrounding socialist China with bases trying to destroy it, that's trying to destroy socialist Venezuela, trying to destroy socialist Nicaragua, trying to destroy socialist Cuba, any country that is socialist or even thinks in that direction or tolerates socialism, right? Joe Biden's doing everything he can to destroy him. And what do they say here? He's a socialist. He's a communist. The Chinese love him. He's a Chinese supporting communist socialist. The most absurd, a guy who really anti-communists, the conservatives here, the so-called conservatives, right? So the redefinition is now Joe Biden's a communist and a socialist. It is, as the liberals become hated, the ruling elite are like, wow, people really hate these damn liberals. That's what we'll do. We will redefine these liberals who absolutely despise socialism into communist and socialism, and we'll use that to continue the anti-socialist sentiment. And people are looking at them, and now it's like, and you hear it everywhere when you listen to conservatives. Yes, these lefties, they're too far left. I had callers on my radio show. The problem is the Democrats are too far left. And I'll say, what do you mean? Well, this whole, everything's about trans and everything. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What does that have to do with left? I'm a lefty. And my definition of left is I view politics through economic class. And then I went on to point out, well, look at Nicaragua. The truth is, whether you're in favor of it or in opposition to it, it has very strong anti-abortion laws. When you look at the socialist countries, the whole trans LGBTQ stuff is not at the forefront of their political movements like it is here with the liberals here. So when you get outside of liberal America, what you're calling left is not left at all. So your thoughts on this redefinition of left, using, as exactly as you said, using identity politics, so that if the liberals who despise the left are the left, what the hell does that make me? A person who sees politics, I don't care what you call me, I see politics through economic. As I've said, people are like, where do your politics come from? And I'm like, my dad was a longshoreman. He was a worker. He wore a hard hat. He went out in the cold, and he went on strike when he needed better benefits, and my family lived better because of it, right? Your thoughts on this whole attempts, and really fairly successful for now, in redefining these liberal fascists as the left because of the trans movement or whatever the hell you want to call that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? You know, the redefinition of the left has been a kind of long, slow process that then, you know, suddenly, you know, it's like quantity transforms into quality. You're having steady little changes and shifts and underminings. And then suddenly, with the trans trend emerging, it's like the butterfly came out of the cocoon, you know, and this thing that had been ongoing for a long time suddenly is fully fledged in front of us. And we find ourselves in this situation where class politics has been completely subsumed. And all the organizations that claim to do class politics have accepted a bourgeois agenda of individualizing politics. And it's not, in fact, about class anymore. Everybody's fighting for their own individual liberation through stuff and recognition and therapy, or some weird combination thereof. And class itself becomes something that is how you feel. You're working class if you feel you are, not because of your relationship to the means of production, not because of the fact you have to sell your labor power in order to feed yourself and your family, but because you feel that you might be working class, or you feel that you might not be working class, you know, and it's up to you to decide and define your class position. You know, what could be more absurd to somebody who actually understands what class is? It's an economic relationship. It's not based on your will. It's based on your reality, right? And that's the whole trick that the transgender movement really exposed, was this way that the two have been, there's been a kind of replacement of one for the other. You know, how you identify as opposed to what your material conditions are.
Right.
And it's material conditions that determine the state of your existence. Not, you know, of course, your state of mind is one thing, and you can go and have some therapy or do some self-discovery to understand that better. But the thing that creates that state of mind is your physical conditions, you know, even down to what food are you eating, you know. Well, even that has a basis in class, right? What food can you afford to eat? You know, how much exercise in the fresh air do you have time to get every day? Well, a lot of that depends on what type of job you have access to, doesn't it? So, you know, our physical material conditions, our position in society economically, the relationship we have to the means of production and how we make our living, that's what determines our reality fundamentally. And that's what Marxism shows, and that's what class politics recognizes. So there's been this kind of trick played on us. And like I said, I talked about that in my book, Identity Politics or Class Politics, trying to show people the danger and why this is something that has to be fought, and that it's not about hating people who've been confused by all of these messages. It's about recognizing the damage it's doing to all of us in terms of our ability to actually get freedom and liberation, right? If we want our freedom and liberation, we have to understand the basis on which we're going to get it. And that's by uniting on class lines and bringing down the system that keeps us enslaved, and creating the new system in which we can be liberated, and where the productive forces serve us instead of enslaving us, right? And that is interfered with by the liberal identity politics approach to life. That just keeps us enslaved and confused and divided. But there's something else in what you were saying. This constant dressing up of people who are really actually fascistic in their attitudes towards the workers and oppressed peoples of the world. And they're in a position they're not just fascistic in their minds, they're fascistic in the policies they're carrying out, right? At home and abroad. You know, people like Joe Biden, the idea you call him a lefty, all that tells me is, well, I don't identify as left anymore. You know, we have to make it clear that, you know, left and right, you know, this spectrum of acceptable politics, it goes from Trotskyism on the extreme left to, you know, fascism, I guess, on the extreme right. This is the spectrum of bourgeois politics. I, as a socialist, I'm not in this spectrum. I'm not playing this game. I'm not trying to get a career running this system. I'm trying to help the working class get itself free from this system. And so my politics don't fit on this spectrum. I'm a socialist. I'm not a left winger. Because for me, the left wing of bourgeois politics is Trotskyism, which is dressing up imperialist politics in revolutionary sounding phrases in order to fool people and stop them really understanding how they're going to get free. It presents itself as revolutionary, but what it actually does is endlessly push forward imperialist agendas. So this left-right spectrum, we have to recognize what it's a spectrum of and why it is that parties like mine don't appear on it. The BBC, when it's talking about the far left, it will mention some Trotskyites. It won't mention my party. The official left in this country, they'll put up a broad platform, and they might invite a Lib Dem on. They might even, if they're feeling really daring, invite someone from what they call the right, from Reform or something on a particular. Do you know who they won't invite? They won't invite me or anyone in my party. And it's not because we're not capable of giving a decent speech, right? It's because we're not on their spectrum. We're not in their officially accepted world of views you can have. And that's because we actually are thinking outside of their box. Our task is to help people to see their way to liberation past this system, through this system, by removing the chains that this system imposes on them. And their job is to keep people embracing their chains, but with different strategies and tactics, depending on the ways in which people are feeling rebellious, right? But just to finally come back to your point about endlessly calling Joe Biden a communist, I think you're absolutely right. In this time where the conditions of working people have been getting steadily and then rapidly worse for 40 years and more, the ruling class's legitimacy is seriously questioned now by growing numbers of its own working people. And this is a problem for social stability for them. Increasing numbers, especially of young people, find the idea of socialism and communism attractive and interesting. They want to know what it is. That's why Mr. Uncle Google, as I like to call him, if you say, what is communism? What is Marxism? He's got a million things to throw at you, which are not communism or Marxism, to keep you busy and stop you from finding the actual communists and Marxists, because it's very dangerous if lots of people are starting to think that they might be friendly towards, communism, socialism, that it might have something to offer them. So the need to keep the fear going and the hatred going and the visceral response of like anything except communism, anything except socialism is the answer. It's all about making sure that when people are angry and trying to rebel, they are kept within the confines of the system when they're looking for solutions. And so telling workers who've learned to really hate the Democrats, just like workers in Britain have learned to really hate the Labour Party, why do they reserve a special hatred for those forces? It's because we were told for so long that these were the forces that were going to take care of us. And we watched them betray us. We voted for them. We believed in them. And they betrayed us endlessly, endlessly, endlessly. And our lives are getting so much worse. And it's been made so clear that they despise and hate us every bit as much as the Tories, Republicans, or perhaps even more so. And there's a visceral response to that now amongst workers who feel really abandoned and let down and like they've been lied to, right? So they really hate Joe Biden. They really hate Keir Starmer. Well, to tell those people who are angry with the system and disillusioned and looking for answers that these guys are communists is a brilliant bit of subterfuge by the ruling class media, really, isn't it? Because communism is actually what they need. Right? If they identify in their minds communism with these people who they know are slimy, betraying, selfish, corrupt, betraying, self-interested charlatans and careerists, then they're not going to want to find out what communism is, are they?
Yeah, and one of the things that I know I keep saying this, but there is something important that this is really important, and I think that the people really need to hear what you have to say, and this is critical in these particular times. One of the things that happened in this last election, very important dynamic, and we can put it a couple different ways. One of the things was talked about in the Black community was the Black misleadership class, right? These comprador class, these people whose jobs, who are very well paid and taken care of, and their job is to deliver these struggling Black voters who are mostly working poor, working class, working poor and poor, right? To deliver their votes to the ruling elite. And now a bunch of those, a lot of the Black working class and struggling class looked at them and said, these people have betrayed us. We hate their guts. And they either stayed home or voted for Trump. Bernie Sanders comes out in 2016. We need these words, revolutionary changes. He uses the word of revolution, right? And then he speaks to the working class, and they're all like, hey, I like what he's saying, right? And they did like what he was saying. He said some of the things that you were saying, some of them. And so all these people are like, yay, we love Bernie, and they're all behind Bernie. And then they watched Bernie say, okay, that didn't work, vote for Hillary. We've got to support Biden. We've got to support the system. We've got to defend the system from Trump. We got to keep this, defend. People are attacking the system. We've got to all come together and defend the system. And then maybe we can pull Joe Biden to the left. If we keep this system in, maybe we can still squeeze a little bit of juice out of this system and you can still get some crumbs. And now what we're seeing is all of those people who are like, yes, Bernie's our guy. They hate him worse than they hate Joe Biden. They hate these facilitators, the comprador class in the Black community, the Bernie Sanders, the people who were struggling workers who thought with maybe a Bernie Sanders, they saw a way out, and they finally heard someone using revolutionary words and appearing to really understand the plight of the working class. They're furious. They feel betrayed. And now they hate those people, this so-called lefty, real so-called lefty, call themselves social democrats, whatever, who offered it to them. It wasn't there and just simply said, okay, you didn't get it. Now go back and support the neoliberals that are screwing you and destroying your lives. And they're really hated. That game is over. They can't come back and play that anymore. Your thoughts on that?
You know, you've underpinned exactly why it is that they need, in this time, to re-up their campaign of vilifying and demonizing the concept of communism and socialism, and tying it to the people who have been exposed as betrayers. It really is a masterstroke. But you're absolutely right. You know, this anger comes from having been let down, having put your faith in people and listened to the words they said and believed them and wanted it to be true. You know, what we've seen is this slow process of very painful education of workers. And it's still an ongoing process, because we see in the Trump vote how many people still cling to this hope that there's a way to fix our problems inside the system. And the problem is that they have to learn that there isn't. But what they need is an organization that can help speed up that process of learning. It is happening. The problem for the American working class, like for the British working class, is they don't have a really good, strong communist party that's rooted in the masses, that is able to reach the people and help them to learn from their own experience about what's happening, how they keep getting let down and betrayed by people they put their faith in. They did it with Obama. They did it with Trump the first time. They did it, as you said, with Bernie. You know, these movements come and people get caught up and think, yes, this guy's saying what I want to hear. And if we just push through, we can and get them into power. So even the phrases, the names we have for things are misleading, aren't they? Because as we've talked about so many times, Garland, the person who's in the White House is not the person who's in charge of America, right? The person who's in 10 Downing Street is not the person who's in charge of Great Britain. But we talk about putting them into power, that if we just get this guy elected, they'll be in power and they'll be empowered to do the things that they promised us to do. Well, you know, we saw with Keir Starmer how quickly after his election, I mean, he promised almost nothing to the working class. Almost
and he's delivered. You got to give him credit. He's delivered almost nothing. No, he hasn't even delivered almost nothing. He's delivered negative, worse than nothing.
Even less, and started ramping up attacks on the working class within seconds of coming into office and proclaiming the importance of standing with Ukraine forever and ever and ever, and keeping all these wars going and sending missiles to Gaza. And, you know, just, you know, exact opposite of what anybody who hoped he might do better was hoping. But, you know, we talked about this as well, didn't we, Garland, about, you know, that I think the big story about these elections wasn't so much how people voted as how many people didn't vote. And, you know, you're right. You know, we saw swings everywhere from the Democrats to the Republicans, people basically endorsing the idea, people who were voting from every section of society, people who were voting, swinging a significant proportion of people swinging from Democrats to Republicans and hoping, holding their nose, hoping that Trump might deliver on just some of the things he's promised and made statements about that they like the idea of, or hoping that just the fact that the establishment seems to really hate him means there must be something good about him, right? And I think they're going to be hugely let down, as they were last time, as we've seen, with Keir Starmer. But what's, I think, also important to take notice of is the absolute number of adults in the USA who actually voted for Trump is in the low 20%, I believe. The number of adults in Britain who voted for Keir Starmer is 18% of all adults. So if you don't take the official electorate, from which loads of people are excluded, if you don't take percentage of people who voted, which leaves out all the people on the electoral roll who didn't come and vote. But if you just look at the adult population and the percentage of those who voted for these, people, they got landslide mandates electorally. And that's what everybody in the media talks about. But if you look how that's been rigged, so it's possible to have this huge mandate based on a very small actually proportion of the votes of the American people. And what I think is significant, Garland, is actually that, while many people in the Black community in the USA rightfully are angry with these communal career politician leaders who treat them as a block, you're Black people from Michigan, and I'm a Black leader from Michigan, and I will deliver your vote in this direction or that direction. Bourgeoisie loves to play these politics. They do it in Britain with Muslims, especially because they tend to still go to mosques. So I think a lot of Black people in America still tend to go to churches. And so you actually have a place where a lot of them will come together, and you can try to kind of direct their voting habits by going into that church and talking to them all together there. Well, they do the same with Muslim communities in Britain. Labour Party has been playing this game with Muslim votes for ever since there were Muslims here, and Sikhs and Hindus, go to the temple, get the temple leader on your side, make sure he's well paid, get someone from the temple in position as local MP, and you're basically, you'll have those votes in the bag forever, right? And they'll make all their wives and friends, and everybody's going to vote your way, and then you don't have to worry about it. That's how you get safe seats in Muslim areas for Labour, over many, many decades. And it was a revolt against that, because of Gaza and Labour's attitude to the genocide in Gaza, that saw some independents elected to Parliament in our last election, because a whole load of Muslim voters said, we are sick of having our votes taken for granted and being told to vote for people who quite obviously don't care what we think about anything and are not serving us. And so these type of rebellions are going to keep coming up. Precisely because all of these misleaders and compradors are doing everything in their power to tie us to people who increasingly, obviously, are acting against our interests. And the more that the interests of the ruling class and the impoverishment of the poor become so obviously opposed to one another, the more that we see that, the politicians are only delivering for the super rich. They're not because of the crisis of overproduction, the economic troubles of the world, the politicians are not in a position to even pretend to deliver anything to the poor. Keir Starmer gets elected and he says, we all have to tighten our belts because there's a hole in the budget. So I'm going to have to do these measures which attack poor, cold pensioners and the poorest of families. And, they're going to have a really terrible time, and their poverty is going to be deepened and entrenched because we really, really, really need to find more billions to send to Ukraine, And, when you see that, these community leaders are coming to you to tell you that you have to vote for that, you can understand why that sense of betrayal gets deeper and deeper. And this is all part of the slow process of people learning to understand that this system is not capable of serving their interests. But, to really complete that education, what we need is proper communist organizations amongst the working class that can, number one, help people realize that more quickly. Number two, disabuse people of their completely wrong notions of what communism actually is, what socialism is, what capitalism is. what class is, what their class interests are, help them start to identify themselves as a class and their interests as a class separately from the system and separately from their interests of the ruling class, and then to organize them as well as to educate and make people aware and conscious of themselves as a class, to organize them as a class so they can start actually to fight for their own interests.
Oh wow! Very, very. This was another great show. Really enjoyed talking with you and exposing all of the things that you have to say, your philosophies, your knowledge of history, and your many decades of brilliant studies. Everyone, it's very important, since these types of things are in fact often censored. It's important that you share this on all your social media platform, that you whether it's Facebook or X or Telegram, whatever the case may be, people online sharing things are the only way we really get people exposed to various philosophies and types of discussions, because certainly we know as Joti calls him, Mr. Google is going to Google us out of the search results. So also, Joti, where can people find you and follow you and get all your good works and see what you're working on?
So I always recommend on the social media front, Telegram as the best way to keep up with our people. We are on Twitter and various other platforms, but I think Telegram is the best one. So you can find me at Joti Brar, Joti Brar. You can see it written there. You can also find my party, The Communists, with an S, on Telegram. Our URL is there, thecommunists.org. A fantastic Marxist website where you will get analysis in the English language that you don't get other places. We have a YouTube channel, Proletarian TV. And just to underline, Garland, a little anecdote. One of our new members came to a meeting that we had in West London on Saturday, and she was telling us she runs a podcast that talks about global affairs. As increasingly people do these days when they make the news rather than listening to the news. She has a regular podcast, and she told us she can add any tag she wants to a podcast, because whatever's relevant to the content, no problem. If she tries to tag our party, it doesn't work. The software freezes up, and she just can't. You just can't do it. So, guys, the manipulation of the algorithm, the shadow banning, the suppression of our party, for the reasons we outlined above, because we're trying to bring truth to people that the ruling class doesn't want you to access. That is a very real thing. It's not imaginary. It's not us just complaining that we're small. There's an active campaign to keep us small and isolated and keep our views away from people. So be aware of that and do whatever things you can to try to break through that.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Enjoy yourself. Have a great day. And we will be back soon. Hopefully, Joti, if you're available next week or as soon as you're available again, we'll have you back on. No doubt the crazies are out here. The imperialists are out there trying to open up fronts in Syria, and who knows what will be. It's interesting. I'm not saying this. What's interesting is they actually see Donald Trump as some kind of a threat. Interestingly enough, I could talk about why they actually do see Donald Trump as a threat. Not Donald Trump as a threat, but I think there are some dynamics that they find threatening. He represents the people pushing back against the system. And yeah, they got Trump this time and he's going to perpetuate the system. But what if they get froggy, as they say, and they think, oh, well, we'll vote for Garland Nixon next time. Darn it, we'll get him. And, whatever the case may be, I think the fact that the people are pushing back, they don't know how to deal with it. Yeah, they got their guy in there, Trump, right now, but he's even unpredictable. They don't know what the hell he's going to do. So going to be interesting times week by week. I'm sure we'll have big things to talk about. But everyone, don't forget to share this. Don't forget to follow Joti Brar. We're out.